The silence that followed the simulation result wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressing against every chest in the room, because numbers don't lie and egos hate that fact, and Daniel could almost feel the shift, the invisible recalibration happening behind polished eyes as executives who had dismissed him now scrambled internally to understand what they had just witnessed, and Marcus Hale slowly exhaled, the kind of breath a man takes when he realizes control has slipped from his hands and landed somewhere unexpected, and he gestured toward the screen again, asking the engineers to rerun it, then again under harsher constraints, then again with variables intentionally distorted, and every single time the system held, flexing instead of fracturing, adapting instead of collapsing, and Daniel watched quietly, his mind drifting not to victory but to memory, to nights spent debugging free software while his daughter slept beside him on a couch because childcare cost more than rent, to being laid off when his wife passed because grief made him less efficient, to interviews where recruiters smiled politely until they heard the words single father, and the room erupted into overlapping questions, voices louder now, sharper, defensive, and one executive demanded to know why this solution hadn't been obvious, and Daniel answered gently that obvious answers are usually invisible when pride blocks the view, a statement that landed harder than any insult, and Marcus raised a hand to silence everyone, his gaze never leaving Daniel, and for the first time since the meeting began, he smiled. Not the practiced corporate smile, but a real one edged with disbelief, and he said, "You walked into this room with nothing but a marker and walked out with our future." And murmurs rippled again, but this time they carried awe instead of mockery, and Daniel felt something unfamiliar tug at him, not triumph but relief, because he hadn't come to prove them wrong. He had come to prove himself right, that he wasn't broken just because life had broken him repeatedly. And as the meeting adjourned, people who wouldn't meet his eyes earlier now lingered, pretending to check phones while hoping for a moment of acknowledgement. And Daniel packed his backpack slowly, methodically, because rushing had never helped him survive anything. And as he reached the door, Marcus stopped him with a quiet, "Daniel," and the entire room froze again, and the CEO said, "You don't know this yet, but today you changed more than an algorithm." And Daniel nodded, not because he fully understood, but because he knew what it felt like to fix something that mattered, and as he stepped into the hallway, the laughter from earlier echoed in his memory. Not as pain anymore, but as proof that resilience doesn't announce itself, that brilliance doesn't always arrive polished, and that the world often underestimates those who carry responsibility instead of ambition. And if you're watching this story right now feeling unseen, doubted, or laughed at, subscribe to this channel, because stories like this aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that your quiet persistence might be one moment away from changing everything. Marcus Hale didn't invite Daniel to sit across the massive desk immediately. Instead, he walked to the window overlooking the city his company dominated, silent for a long moment as if recalculating everything he thought he knew about power. And when he finally turned, his voice was lower, stripped of its usual authority, asking Daniel if he knew how close the company had been to collapse, and Daniel answered honestly that he didn't need to know, because broken systems always look different from the inside, and that answer unsettled Marcus more than any technical explanation ever could, because it revealed something terrifying. This man hadn't solved the problem for recognition, fear, or leverage. He had solved it because it was broken, and Marcus offered him the role again, bigger this time, with influence that could reshape entire divisions, and Daniel listened patiently before explaining the one condition that mattered most, that his daughter would never feel like she came second to a title, and Marcus, a man who had missed birthdays, funerals, and marriages for success, felt something tighten in his chest, realizing that this quiet single dad possessed a kind of wealth he himself had never earned. And so policies changed quietly, flexibility became strategy, and Daniel's approach began spreading through the company like oxygen. Teams stopped competing internally and started stabilizing processes. Turnover dropped, productivity rose, but Daniel's name stayed off press releases by his own request, because real impact didn't need applause. And months later, when a junior engineer nervously thanked him for making the workplace humane again, Daniel smiled the same tired smile he wore when helping his daughter with homework. Because fixing people mattered more than fixing code, and the same executives who once laughed now watched him with respect edged with humility, understanding too late that the strongest people don't demand attention. They earn silence when they speak, and on a quiet evening, as Daniel walked out of the building under city lights instead of applause, his phone buzzed with a message from his daughter asking if he'd be home for dinner, and he replied, "Always," because that was the promise that had guided every decision. And if this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated, ignored, or laughed at while carrying responsibilities no one else could see, subscribe to this channel right now, because every story here is for the quiet fighters, the single parents, the overlooked minds, and the people who prove, without shouting, that resilience, humility, and purpose will always outlast arrogance. The real test didn't come in boardrooms or simulations, it came quietly, months later, when success had settled into routine and admiration had replaced laughter, because that's when systems reveal whether change is real or temporary, and Daniel noticed the cracks before anyone else. The subtle return of ego, the shortcuts justified by pressure, the whispers of old ways worked better. And instead of confronting them publicly, he did what he had always done. He listened, he observed, and he adjusted, mentoring silently, restructuring processes without headlines, protecting junior voices the same way he protected his daughter from disappointment. And when an unexpected crisis hit, a sudden market shock that threatened to undo everything, the executives panicked, reverting to fear-driven decisions, but Daniel stood steady, reminding them that control collapses under panic just like systems do. And this time they listened without laughter, without resistance, because trust had replaced doubt, and the company survived not because of brilliance but because of discipline and empathy. And one evening, Marcus Hale admitted something he had never said out loud, that he once believed strength meant dominance, until he saw a single dad redefine it as responsibility. And Daniel didn't respond with pride, only with understanding, because strength had never been a theory for him, it had been survival. And as the company moved forward, Daniel slowly stepped back from visibility, choosing impact over image, walking his daughter to school instead of chasing applause. And when people asked why he never told his story publicly, he answered simply that the loudest lessons are learned by watching, not listening. And years later, when a young consultant walked into that same conference room carrying doubt instead of confidence, Daniel smiled, because cycles only break when someone chooses to be different. And if this chapter touched you, if you believe quiet resilience can outlast mockery and responsibility is the truest form of power, subscribe to this channel, because these stories aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that your persistence, even when laughed at, may be shaping a future far bigger than you imagine.